What is positive is that just over the past couple of years, I've noticed that most people now know what PFAS are in the general public and are making attempts to reduce their exposure. Also, a lot of consumer products will now list if this is a no PFAS product. So I think it's because the awareness has gone up and up and up. The companies are going to start taking it out because people don't want to buy these products if they have PFAS in them. So I think that's actually a very positive outcome of all of this. Unfortunately, it's quite ubiquitous now. There's so many different exposure pathways. PFAS are used in so many different products. They're generally everywhere. 7% of Americans have detected levels of PFAS. I am a postdoctoral fellow. I work both with the University of Southern California and the University of Washington. My background was in epidemiology, and now I'm doing more clinically focused work. We look at complications of diabetes in youth, specifically focusing on kidney function and liver function and things like that. But I have in the past looked at the effect of environmental exposures on these different biological processes. So that's kind of one of our focuses.
At what point did you start looking at environmental exposures? Can you take me back to how that journey started for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background was actually in nutrition and more basic biology. And so when I started my PhD, I was looking at dietary exposures. And so diet is a major exposure pathway for PFAS chemicals. So that's actually how I started looking at PFAS. My first project in my doctoral work was to look at different dietary sources of PFAS. So that's kind of how I got into the environmental world.
So PFAS is a very, very interesting subject. So, and I think there are different schools of thought regarding what the response, the strategy to addressing PFAS should be. So, what does PFAS look like from the perception of Hailey?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, it's quite ubiquitous now. I think there's so many different exposure pathways. PFAS are used in so many different products. And so I think that they're generally everywhere. We're seeing that. 97% of Americans have detected levels of PFAS, according to NHANES, which is a nationally representative survey of the United States. So I think that PFAS are definitely present. And then we have this growing body of evidence that's seeing that PFAS are associated with a variety of health outcomes in a negative way. So I think this is definitely a really important area. But I think what's hard is that we're seeing PFAS are associated with this health effect, this disease, this different thing. And sometimes it's hard to understand how that's happening. And so we're trying to look at more mechanistic studies that understand what exactly are PFAS doing that are leading to the increased risk. So I think that's kind of where PFAS research is at right now, and our study kind of fits into that context.
Looking at what we know about PFAS at the moment, do you think the evidence and the science is unequivocal and the science ecosystem is now speaking with one voice on the risk of PFAS?
I do think that the scientific community is speaking with one voice that PFAS are definitely an issue for public health. I think everyone is going to have a different opinion on whether or not the evidence is really ubiquitous or not. I personally think that, yes, there's a lot of evidence pointing to this having effects on the human body and also the ecosystem as well.
So let's talk about the study. When did you start? What was the journey to the study like for you?
Yeah, so after I looked at dietary sources of PFAS, we found different foods and beverages that there were potentially higher levels of PFAS in, and then we wanted to look at what is the effect of being exposed to PFAS. So I did a study looking at the association of PFAS with the gut microbiome. That study is currently still under review, but we did find that there were significant associations between mixtures of PFAS chemicals and the gut microbiome. So then we wanted to look at PFAS we're being exposed through diet. There seem to be affecting the microbiome. There's also a lot of evidence showing that PFAS could be affecting kidney disease or kidney function. And so we wanted to use a framework where we looked at, does PFAS affect kidney function and does it affect it through the gut microbiome? So that's kind of what led us to this study.
I see that you have a lot of people on the teams. Was it an already existing team or did you have to assemble this team?
The authors on the paper?
Yes.
Yes. So primarily the lab is based at University of Southern California. That was our main sort of PFAS working group. And then we also collaborated with other experts in the field. So we worked with some microbiome experts that are on the paper, and also some individuals that focus on kidney disease. So those were collaborators that we wanted to help with this study, and they're ongoing collaborators. So the team came together pretty naturally.
Okay, now let's challenge you and see how much you can simplify the process. So what did you do? Not yet into what did you find. So what did you do?
Yes. So simply speaking, we looked at the association between blood levels of PFAS. So in this young adult cohort, we collected blood measures, and then we quantified their levels of PFAS in the blood. And then we looked at their kidney function 4 years later. And that's assessed by a measure called estimated glomerular filtration rate, or EGFR. And that was just looking at how well the kidney is filtering and how well the kidney is functioning. So the first thing we did was just look at, is there an association? And yeah, so that was the most simple first step.
Okay. Then the next question I now have for you is looking at the connections, because you said you have to now check a couple of years data. How were you able to exclude other confounding factors that would have, somebody can say probably the association is not due to PFAS, but something else in the person's body?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so we did adjust for confounding variables. In that first analysis between PFAS exposure and kidney function, we adjusted for age, sex, race, ethnicity, and parental education as a marker for socioeconomic status. And then, so that's how we adjusted for the confounding variables potentially in the model. And then we also use that in our additional analysis steps.
You're already doing well simplifying research. Have you been taking classes on science communication?
We've done a lot of these interviews.
Okay, really good, really good. So let's talk about the results. So what did you find quite intriguing in your findings?
Yeah, so I think the first thing was that we just generally found that individuals that had higher exposure to PFAS chemicals, or a higher mixture of those PFAS in their blood, had lower kidney function. And so that was kind of already somewhat seen in the literature. So then we added this additional mediation step, which was to look at, is the microbiome contributing, or are metabolite levels in the blood contributing to that effect? And that's where we saw some of the novel findings, where we saw that individuals that had higher exposure to PFAS had lower levels of beneficial bacteria, and they had reduced numbers of anti-inflammatory metabolites, and that might be contributing to that lower kidney function.
Interesting. So tell me, let's talk about this association, the connection between PFAS to kidney impairment. What is that direct relationship? How would you describe the process that results in that end result?
Yeah, do you mean the biological mechanism?
Yes.
Yes. So I think the general understanding from the literature before our study was that PFAS could be directly impacting the kidney through oxidative stress and inflammation. The kidneys filter out PFAS, and so the kidneys are an area where PFAS can accumulate to a large degree, and so then they can cause some physical damage in the kidneys. But the other mechanism that we were looking at is the indirect mechanism. So PFAS could affect the gut microbiome, and then the gut microbiome profile can change, leading to different metabolite levels, and that could be impacting the kidney. So I think it's both direct and indirect.
Yes, we need to go back, gut microbiome now. For somebody that is hearing that for the first time, how will you explain what they call microbiome mean?
Yeah, absolutely. The gut microbiome is essentially all of the bacteria in the gut that help with a lot of metabolic processes and digestion of your food. So they're a very integral part of the digestive system. So yes, that's generally what it is.
Yeah, let's talk about potential interventions or solutions. We've been able to establish the threat posed by PFAS to kidney function. So, do we have any indication from your results on how to probably respond to, or manage or treat these effects?
Yeah, so this is actually an area that is probably the most underdeveloped in terms of what we know, is how do we actually mitigate the response to PFAS. I think the nice thing about our results is it suggests that if we perform interventions that help reestablish homeostasis in the gut that could help mitigate some of the damage from PFAS. So I think that dietary interventions and drug interventions could be a really important next step to determine, can we mitigate some of those effects from PFAS? Currently, there's not a whole lot of evidence about that. The other thing is, once we have PFAS in our bodies, we don't actually know how to get rid of them. And so other interventions that would be really important is just, how can we remove PFAS from the body, not even just repair the damage? So could a high fiber diet help to excrete some of the PFAS from the body? Are there certain drugs that would help increase the excretion? Things like that are still very understudied, but I think would be really important for mitigation.
Do you think PFAS associated effect, they've risen to a significant public health concern level? Or how would you describe the severity of the threat posed by PFAS?
Yeah, the severity, or do you mean kind of like what is the magnitude of the effect? Like, oh yes, there's association, but how bad is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's kind of important is that it seems like individuals who are already at high risk of developing chronic disease potentially have higher exposure as well. And so I think that that's where the risk can be higher if you have individuals that are already at risk and now you have this additional chemical that's causing further damage. I think that is very troubling. There's also a lot of social and political issues related to where PFAS is distributed in water and things like that. So I think there are groups that are at much higher risk because they're being exposed to very high levels. And then there are other groups that have lower risk. Potentially, they can afford really good PFAS filtering systems for their water. Reverse osmosis systems help to remove PFAS from water, things like that. I think the risk is somewhat different by different risk factors, if that makes sense.
I want to I want to understand and appreciate the severity of the problems, and I think you are indirectly indicating that there are also inequity issues at stake regarding that. So can you give me an insight into how this is playing out?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not intentionally dancing around it. I think most of the hesitation is that a lot of these results are associations. And so we want to be careful not to say anything causal. I can say for this study specifically, we were looking at a population that had a higher distribution of Hispanic young adults. And just based on the literature, Hispanic young adults have higher risk of chronic disease. And in some studies have been shown to have higher exposure to PFAS in water. That's definitely related to inequities in geographic distributions and things like that. So I don't know if that's what you were asking about, but I think that's definitely very important. Yeah, and that's why we were looking at this population, because Hispanic young adults in Southern California are already at increased risk of chronic disease. So it's really important.
I'm curious to know, why do you think these PFAS associated problems, or PFAS as a subject on its own, is still not very much appreciated by the general public? During your research, did you have an insight into how aware they are about PFAS and the threat posed by PFAS to their health? And what do you think is driving that level of awareness or lack of awareness?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can say it seems to be that there's a general understanding in the general public. When we published several of our studies related to PFAS, there was quite a large response from the general public. I will say I'm not sure what level of understanding there is amongst the population that we were specifically working with. But I think part of these studies is that we want to also bring awareness to that group. So once we have the results, a big portion of what we want to do is then disseminate the results so that the population's aware of their exposure. And I know that's a big part of the ongoing research at USC, is the education around it as well.
Okay. Then the biological mechanisms that you've identified in the study, does it give us any indication regarding how we can better understand the ecological impact of PFAS on ecosystems, not just on humans, but also on biodiversity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is established that PFAS affect different ecosystems and wildlife. I think what this study could potentially contribute to that is that we're seeing PFAS may impact gut bacteria. So they could potentially be impacting bacterial communities in the environment, as well as gut bacteria for wildlife. That's not exactly my area, but I do think that has been seen in the past, and also it would make sense logically that that could extend to animals as well.
Okay, from not just from your research, but from the conversation, especially in the US on PFAS, what do you think is being proposed as the best way to tackle this threat?
Yeah, I think it has to come from a couple different places. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, most people have already been exposed to PFAS. So I think there are a lot of attempts to reduce exposure on that front. But I think because we're all exposed to some degree, we really do need to start finding ways to remove PFAS from the body or ways to mitigate the damage. So I would say a really important area that we need to focus on is interventions to reduce PFAS levels in the body once you're already exposed.
So what do you think that intervention would look like?
I think that there are a couple different ways. There have been a few studies that have shown higher fiber consumption can help to reduce PFAS in the body just by excreting it. I think there's also potentially a few drugs that might have that effect as well. So it could be something as simple as a drug that helps to remove more PFAS from the body. So yeah.
What do you consider to be current research priorities around PFAS contamination?
Yeah, in terms of research priorities, I mean, I would say again, like the interventions to reduce the current body levels or tissue levels. I feel like a lot of research does still focus on what are the effects. I think we're still trying to understand the mechanisms. So that's something we kind of looked at mechanisms in our study, but we still don't know exactly how PFAS affect the microbiome or how PFAS affect metabolite levels. So I think a lot of research is also using some of our new technologies to look at actual mechanisms and how PFAS affect cells and metabolism, gene expression, things like that.
Now about policies, I think you've mentioned the fact that looking at providing support for people that are already exposed to it and testing ways to get PFAS out of people's bodies the way forward. Do you still have any indications on what policy priorities can still include?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways that policy could help. I think honestly, biomonitoring of foods and beverages that are readily consumed and available is really important because food and water is a huge exposure source. I think that having screening for individuals is something that's going on right now. And especially if you're living in a high risk area, there are ways that you can be screened and find out how much PFAS you have. I think another area is water filtration. Not all water filtration systems actually remove PFAS from water, but there are newer ones. Reverse osmosis is one of the types that actually helps remove PFAS from the water. So I think things like that, where you may have some exposure, but you can at least prevent increasing your exposure, that could be very helpful. So I know there are some ongoing studies looking at if you provide water filtration, how does that affect exposure levels? And then just generally policy regulations on what PFAS are being used in, where PFAS is being eliminated, where it's being dumped after it's being used. I think that's really important too.
Yeah, talking of probably bringing a positive story to this, where do you consider to be a model for PFAS response? Is there a setting that you think, okay, if others are doing what they are doing here regarding PFAS, we could make a lot of impact?
Yeah, actually, I think that I'm not familiar with what's going on in other PFAS groups across the country or across the world, but I do know at USC there are many different individuals from engineering, from biology, from epidemiology that come together, and they're working on different ways of actually removing PFAS from the system, coming from kind of like a multifaceted approach. I think that's the best chance we have, or from a clinical point of view, from an engineering point of view, how can we reduce PFAS being introduced into the environment? How can we filter it out of water, filter out of food? I think it's going to require a lot of different groups coming together. And I think that's ongoing. So I think that has potential.
Yeah, I'm just curious to know, PFAS falls under environment topic that I think you would agree with me is not totally isolated from politicization. Some essentially calling for relaxing regulations. Meanwhile, for us to be able to get rid of these things in people's body, to filter them out of water, standards need to be put in place, watchdogs need to be put in place. So how do you think this distant or close politicization could have impact on the potential achievements that could actually be realistically achieved in PFAS control? Are you concerned about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. I think it's definitely a concern. I think one of the issues is that PFAS are being introduced into the environment because they're used in so many consumer products. And so having lax regulations on that could definitely increase the issue. I think at least one of the positive things is that the public, in my opinion, knows about PFAS and knows generally where they're coming from. And the public is quite frustrated about that. So even as regulations potentially could lax, I don't think that the issue is going to go away and the awareness is going to go away. So I think the research is going to continue looking at ways that we can mitigate the risk at least.
So how can we, what do you think we can translate from your research now into actionable public health strategies?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think we do have some limitations in terms of this study for how we can actually make it actionable at the moment. This was a really small sample size that we looked at, and it was sort of in the title of our paper, it's a proof of concept study. So we were using a lot of new analytical methods to look at this association. I think this is great in terms of generating hypotheses for future studies, particularly those intervention studies I was talking about that could be looking at dietary interventions and potentially drug interventions. But it is a little hard at this point to actually set actionable next steps from this since it's kind of an early study.
Are there other challenges that you think are limiting the translation of PFAS research findings into actionable policies? Not just your
Yeah.
own PFAS studies in general.
Absolutely. I think one of the issues with epidemiologic work in general is that when we're looking at these toxic chemicals, you can never perform an experimental study. You can never knowingly expose humans to toxic chemicals. So we mostly have to use observational studies where we look at if someone's already exposed, what association can we see? So I think that's one of the reasons why it's really hard to say like 100% PFAS are causing this. But I think that there are starting to be studies looking at more mechanistic, you can actually do an experimental study in animal studies or cell culture studies. So I think that's maybe an avenue we can go to try and see more concrete results that would then be more actionable.
So did you interact directly with one-on-one with some of the study participants?
I personally did not. As a PhD at the time, I was several steps removed, so at the data level. But I do know our group does do outreach with the participants of the study.
So what insights can you give me regarding the people that were recruited or that participated in the study?
Yeah, I think that kind of in a lot of public health research, we're trying to identify a lot of these social determinants of health and some of the systemic reasons why some groups have higher exposure and higher risk. So I think from one of my early studies, we found that certain foods and beverages had higher PFAS exposure. And a lot of people probably want to say, oh, well, people should just not consume these things, don't buy it, whatever. I think it's a much bigger issue in terms of food and beverage access and things like that. I would say the burden of these changes should not be on the participants. I think there's a lot of contributing factors related to that. So, yeah, that's what I that's all I got.
So what's next regarding this research? What is happening next? Where are you taking it to?
Yeah, so this was looking at, PFAS and kidney function. So we do have a lot of ongoing studies looking at kidney function. I'm personally starting to look at other environmental chemicals as well, including microplastics and the effects that those have. Microplastics and PFAS also coexist quite a lot. So there's the potential to look at how PFAS in combination with other chemicals can impact the body or things like microplastics. And I think some of the other ongoing work that we have is looking at if you do have damage to PFAS in the kidneys, for example, what strategies can be used to mitigate that damage or reverse some of the damage. So I know that's what some of the group is working on.
So do you still think we have wide knowledge gap regarding PFAS, or do you think what we have is concrete enough to introduce actionable policies?
I think there are ongoing policies in place. I think it's definitely been established across, the body of literature. So yeah, I think it's well established. I think policies are in place. It's just a matter of seeing how it goes over time and if it actually helps to reduce risk.
Like you said, it's not everywhere that we are seeing policies being aggressively implemented or introduced or backed by law. If we don't get on top of a situation regarding PFAS control regulation, in how big of a problem do you think this could become?
Yeah, I mean, I think we already have a huge issue, at least in our country, which is what I focus on in terms of chronic disease. So I think if we continue to have increased exposure to environmental chemicals, they're going to continue to make the chronic disease risk much, much worse. And we're obviously trying to do the opposite and reduce the disease rate. So I think that would definitely contribute to that.
Then what are you optimistic about?
Um, That's a great question. I think what is positive is that most people now, just over the past couple of years, I've noticed that most people now know what PFAS are in the general public and are making attempts to reduce their exposure. There's also a lot of consumer products will now list if PFAS are, this is a no PFAS product. So I think it's because the awareness has gone up and up and up. The companies are going to start taking it out because people don't want to buy these products if they have PFAS in them. So I think that's actually a very positive outcome of all of this.
Are you concerned that PFAS research funding might be impacted from January 20?
Potentially, yes. I think it is. I think there are a lot of different areas of our research that can be impacted by that. I'm not so sure about PFAS specifically. I think there are some areas that will have increase. I know that certain things like microplastics are actually potentially having more funding. So I'm not really sure which way it will go. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Thanks, Hailey. Last remarks for me?
No. Thank you for inquiring about our study. It was great chatting with you.
So thank you so much, Hailey, for speaking with me. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you too.
Enjoy the rest of your day.